The ocean roars as a weathered ship battles towering waves, salt spray stinging the sailors' faces, and wind howling through the rigging. Below deck, men clutch their personal treasures, tiny objects packed with hope and memory, each telling stories of courage amidst despair. These sailors faced storms that threatened to swallow them whole. Hunger gnawed at their guts and sickness lurked in every crevice. Yet they pressed on, driven by dreams of new worlds and the promise of fame or fortune. Their daily struggles and personal keepsakes reveal a human story of resilience and sacrifice amid the vast indifferent sea. It's a testament to bravery that echoes through centuries. If you're fascinated by these daring voyages and the human spirit that fueled them, hit subscribe to reach 3,000 followers. Share where you're watching from, and let me know you're with us by dropping a wave or a sail emoji, because this journey is just beginning. You ever wonder how it felt to be a sailor trapped on a ship in the middle of the endless ocean? Imagine the chill that cuts through your bones as cold spray crashes over the deck, the salty air stinging your face, and the creaking wood beneath your feet. The sun beats down mercilessly during the day. Then at night, the cold wind slices through whatever layers of clothing you have. Now combine that with the constant danger of storms, disease, and starvation. Yeah, those voyages weren't just long, they were brutal tests of survival. Today, we're diving into the gritty side of the age of exploration, that extraordinary period from the late 1400s to the 1700s, when Europeans set out to discover new worlds. These journeys weren't just about maps and riches, they were about real people with hopes, fears, and personal stories, all packed into tiny, rickety ships that seemed barely fit for purpose. If you love history, maritime tech, and human resilience, stick around because I'm going to reveal 9 personal objects sailors carried on these colonial voyages, and how they tell us so much about their daily struggles. Back then, ships like caravels, galleons, and nawies were marvels of engineering, crafted from about 2,000 trees each, with planks sewn together using iron nails and wooden pegs. The construction was a patchwork of techniques passed down for generations. The decks were narrow and often flooded with seawater, making every step slippery, every noise a reminder of the constant danger of a leak or a storm. The ship's hull was reinforced with tar and pitch, trying to keep seawater out, but water seeped in no matter what. Imagine the claustrophobic feeling, just wood and canvas holding back the abyss. Life on board was a daily grind. The hierarchy was strict. The captain at the top, followed by the master, the ship's engineer and navigator, then the boatswain, carpenters, and finally the common sailors. Everyone had a role, but survival depended on cooperation under extreme conditions. Your routine? Rise with the sun, work tirelessly repairing the rigging, scrubbing decks soaked in salt, or standing watch in the freezing night. There were moments of boredom, but mostly a constant fight against fatigue, hunger, and despair. Imagine the noise, the creaking timbers, the shriek of the wind, and the relentless splash of waves. Now picture the hardships. Food was scarce, often spoiled, and lacked variety. Salted meat, dried peas, hardtack. Imagine chewing that rock-hard bread with a mouthful of salt and mold. Diseases like scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, decimated crews, sometimes wiping out half the crew before they even reached land. The constant exposure to cold, damp conditions led to persistent illnesses. The crew's tiny cabins offered little relief. You can forget comfort. These sailors faced dehydration, frostbite, and infections every day. Nautical navigation itself was a challenge. Instruments like the astrolabe, quadrant, and compass were rudimentary compared to today's GPS. The sailors relied on the sun, stars, and rough calculations to guide their way. Imagine the tension as they squinted into the night sky, hoping they'd find land or avoid deadly reefs. The ships had to be engineered for stability. Ballast made from stones, or sand kept them upright when the waves tossed them around. But even with the best techniques, shipwrecks weren't uncommon. Just a sudden storm or a reef could end everything. Despite all this, sailors found ways to humanize their suffering. They carried objects that reminded them of home, hope, or loved ones. These objects weren't just trinkets, they were lifelines to their sanity. And each object tells a story about their personal resilience, their fears, and their moments of solace amid chaos. So, what did they carry? Well, they brought personal objects, small portable items that offered comfort or a sense of identity. like a pocket watch, a crucifix, a carved amulet, or a simple knife. These objects could be made from bone, wood, or metal, materials easy to carry in a pocket or sewn into clothing. They were their anchors in a sea of uncertainty. The survival of these brave sailors wasn't just about the ship's design or the star charts. They were about human grit. They faced months at sea, often with no land in sight, into storms that seemed to tear the sky apart, all while battling hunger, sickness, and despair. Their personal objects remind us that even in the worst conditions, hope persisted. These tiny items carried their stories, their fears, and their dreams of reaching land again. So next time you think about the grand maps or treasure hunts, remember the real stories, the individuals who endured the unimaginable. Because behind every voyage was a human story of suffering, resilience, and survival, etched into the objects they carried and into history itself. Can you imagine what it felt like to stand on the deck of a ship, surrounded by the salty, biting wind? The cold was relentless, slicing through your clothes like tiny knives. The air carried an unending chorus of creaking wood, splashing waves, and the distant cry of seabirds. Your skin was numb, your hands trembling as the salt stung your lips and the smell of rotting wood mixed with the brine. Now picture yourself trapped in that floating prison, enduring weeks, maybe months of this torment. Today, we're going to dive into the gritty reality of colonial maritime life. We'll explore what sailors carried, what they faced, and how they survived this cruel but human adventure across uncharted waters. If you like deep dives into history's human stories, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to uncover more maritime secrets, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, imagine the age of exploration, a time when ships like the Carrack or the Galleon became the ultimate machines of adventure. These vessels could carry hundreds of men, sometimes over 1,000 across vast oceans. But behind the grandeur, there was a brutal daily reality. Life on board was a constant struggle against nature and oneself. The ship's hull was a maze of narrow, dark cabins where sailors slept on planks, sometimes 2 or 3 to a space, clutching their meager possessions. The smell of sweat, mold, and damp wood was suffocating. The crew's days started before dawn, with the first light barely piercing the heavy canvas sails. They worked tirelessly, hoisting sails, repairing rigging, bailing water with buckets that splashed mercilessly in the cold. And that's when the real horror begins. Sickness, starvation, and death lurking just beneath the surface. The sailors' most valued possessions, well, they weren't gold or jewelry. They were objects that kept them alive or gave them a small piece of comfort amidst chaos. Imagine carrying a tiny battered knife, vital for daily chores or defending yourself, a small mirror to check your teeth or gaze at a distant face in moments of loneliness, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, sometimes your only meal for days, and perhaps most precious of all, a small vial of medicine, often just herbs or alcohol, desperately trying to fend off disease. These objects were not just possessions, they were lifelines. But it wasn't just about possessions. Sailors often carried something more personal, tokens of home, trinkets, even religious charms. It might be a carved wooden cross, a lock of hair from loved ones, or a small picture. These objects anchored them to the world they'd left behind, fighting against the overwhelming vastness of the ocean and their own fears. Now here's where it gets even darker. The ocean itself was often hostile, unpredictable, almost alive with rage. Storms could swell in minutes, transforming a serene blue into a monstrous grey wall of fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at sails, snapping, rigging and tossing the ship like a toy. The crew clung to the rails, their knuckles white as the ship pitched and rolled. It was easy to lose your balance, tumble into the freezing water, and be swallowed by the depths. And if somehow you survived the storm, well, you'd be exhausted, your body battered, and perhaps already infected by the relentless damp and cold. The ship's timbers groaned under pressure, cracking in the cold, each creak a warning of impending disaster. But the dangers weren't just weather. Disease spread faster than wildfire. Imagine the chaos of a sailor vomiting overboard, his cheeks gaunt, eyes glassy with fever, gums bleeding, teeth falling out, body trembling from chills. Dysentery, scurvy, scabies, they were the ship's invisible killers. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables meant vitamin C deficiency was rampant. Cans of preserved food, you might think, sure, but these were often spoiled, infested with worms, or covered in mold. The sailors' diet was monotonous, bland, and rotten, and still they ate, hoping to stave off death even as their bodies betrayed them. Epidemics could wipe out entire crews. Imagine losing a quarter of your mates in just a few weeks. The ship's doctor, usually an ill-equipped, overworked man armed with herbal concoctions and old wives' tales. His tools, a rusty lancet, a cracked mortar for grinding herbs, and a handful of dried roots. There was no real medicine, just desperate attempts to stave off the inevitable. The disease was a merciless murderer, and the boat became a floating tomb for some. And speaking of survival, sailors developed strange, sometimes brutal routines. When someone fell ill, the crew might put them in a makeshift quarantine if they could find space. Often, it was just a corner of the ship, draped in torn sails. The sick were left isolated, sometimes chained, sometimes just left to die alone amid the endless creaks of the hull. The smell of death clung to the air like a fog. Those who recovered, they bore scars, both physical and emotional. Their bodies might be permanently weakened, their spirits scarred by the constant threat of losing everything. Hydration was another nightmare. Water went sour quickly, turning into a foul, salty slush. Fresh water was a precious commodity, sometimes rationed so strictly that sailors were parched, their lips cracked and bleeding. They drank seawater only when desperation pushed them to the brink. That made dehydration worse, and in the hot tropics, it was a death sentence. Imagine the burning thirst, the salty tears mixing with sweat, skin-peeling mouths, raw. And yet, amid all this horror, sailors found ways to cope. They sang shanties to drown the noise of the waves and their fears. They shared stories of home, of loved ones they might never see again. These songs weren't just entertainment. They were a lifeline, a secret rebellion against the madness. Some carried small images, or relics, clutching them tightly during storms, as if they could conjure safety. Others relied on faith, prayers whispered in the dark, glowing in the gloom of the night. But it wasn't just about surviving the storm, sickness, or starvation. It was about enduring the mental toll. Imagine how your mind would turn in moments of loneliness, when the horizon was nothing but endless water and sky. The fear of never returning home, of dying alone in this floating nightmare. That psychological strain was part of the voyage, wearing down even the strongest sailors, transforming them physically and emotionally. And what about the ship itself building these? Ships was no small feat. They used up to 2,000 trees for a single vessel, shaping massive planks of oak, pine, and cedar. The nails, mostly iron, hammered in by hand, each one corrosion-prone, rusting in the salty air. The craftsmanship was incredible, but fragile. One bad storm, one cracked timber, and the entire vessel could break apart, lost forever beneath the waves. The ships were designed for speed and cargo capacity, but not comfort. They were brutal, functional, and unforgiving. So, as we look through this window into the lives of these sailors, we see more than just maps and dates. We see human beings, brave, battered, fighting against nature's fury and their own bodies. Their possessions tell stories of hope and despair. Their struggles reveal what it truly meant to be a sailor during the age of exploration. If you want to know exactly how they survived, what they carried, how they fought disease, how they faced storms, you'll want to check out the video I've got coming up. We'll peel back the layers of history and get even closer to the human experience of these maritime adventures. But for now, just imagine how these brave souls endured their voyage. One wave, one sickness, one object at a time. It's a story of resilience, suffering, and human spirit, and it's a story worth remembering. Imagine you're sailing across the vast, relentless Atlantic. The wind howls like a beast, the deck trembles under your feet, and the salty air cuts like a razor. Life on a colonial ship wasn't just about steering through storms. It was a relentless fight against 1,000 tiny killers, each one more insidious than the last. Today, we're diving into the gritty reality of those sailors' daily struggles, what they carried, how they fought the odds, and the harrowing stories behind the objects that helped them survive. First, let's talk about the ship itself, the floating prison that was both marvel and nightmare. These vessels were monumental, feats of carpentry, built with up to 2,000 trees each. Picture the sheer volume of timber, oak, pine, cedar, shaped into planks, nailed together with iron nails hammered by hand. The process was laborious, time-consuming, and incredibly dangerous. The nails, mostly iron, rusted quickly in the salty air, compromising the ship's integrity. A single cracked plank or a badly set nail could turn the entire vessel into a sinking coffin, but they knew how to patch things up, sometimes with pitch or tar, sealing cracks temporarily, hoping the storm would pass. And speaking of storms, imagine the chaos of a cyclone battering your ship, the howling, wind, the creaking of battered timbers, and the sudden bone-chilling cold that would seep in, piercing your bones. Sailors used to lash broken spars with ropes or bits of cloth, improvising repairs in seconds. Their ship's design prioritized speed and cargo space, not comfort. These ships were brutal, unforgiving, and built for survival, not rest. They carried everything they needed in the cramped holds: clothes, tools, sometimes even personal objects that meant hope or home. Now let's talk about what sailors carried in their pockets, those tiny objects that meant the world amid the chaos. These personal items told stories of hope, fear, and resilience. For instance, many sailors kept small religious tokens, crucifixes, medals, or amulets, clinging to faith in a god they hoped would save them. Imagine a sailor's hand trembling as he clutched that tiny silver cross, feeling its weight against his sweaty palm, trying to drown out the screams of the storm. Or think about a sailor's knife, worn from years of use, always at his side, cutting rope, opening food, fighting off disease. But it wasn't just about faith or survival gear. Many sailors also carried personal keepsakes, photos, small trinkets, or even a lock of hair from loved ones. These objects were tiny anchors in a sea of chaos, moments of human connection that could be lost in seconds if disaster struck. And disaster was always lurking. Imagine how the ship's crew dealt with one crisis after another, each more terrifying than the last. Let's explore some of those specific problems, starting with the relentless threat of scurvy, a disease that turned gums into bloody ribbons and teeth to fall out like autumn leaves. The solution? Vitamin C-rich foods, citrus fruits, preserved limes, precious commodities that were scarce on long voyages. Sailors would trade their last biscuit for a slice of lemon, desperately hoping to stave off the hideous symptoms. But often the cure came too late. Next, consider the battle against filth, an invisible, ever-present enemy. Bacteria, mold, and decay thrived in the humid, crowded conditions of the ship's hold. To combat this, sailors used vinegar or saltwater washes, trying to keep their living spaces from turning into breeding grounds for disease. Still, infections spread rapidly. Imagine the blood pulsing in their gums, the fever rising, skin turning yellow, each one a potential death sentence. And then there were the pests, lice, rats, and the dreaded shipworm. Rats were cunning creatures, gnawing on ropes, spreading disease. Sailors would set traps, use foul-smelling oils, anything to keep them at bay. But the worst was the shipworm, a tiny mollusk that burrowed into the hull, eating away at the wood from the inside. Without proper maintenance, a ship could literally fall apart beneath your feet. The solution? Regular inspections, caulking and replacing weakened planks, an ongoing battle with nature's tiny, destructive army. But not all problems were physical. The psychological toll was brutal. Imagine being weeks or months from home with no land in sight. The endless horizon becomes a mirror for your fears. Will you see your loved ones again? Will your body hold out? The loneliness gnaws at your mind, turning hope into despair. Sailors tried to cope with small comforts, playing cards, singing shanties, whispering prayers into the dark. Yet some couldn't withstand it. Stories tell of men going mad, jumping overboard in the dead of night, desperate to escape their torment. And that brings us to another haunting object carried by sailors, a small worn journal or a prayer book. These were tiny islands of sanity, words of comfort penned in moments of quiet, a record of hopes and fears. Imagine a young sailor, Gaspar, clutching his diary, scribbling last words as storm waves crash above. That diary might be the only thing anchoring him to humanity, to his own fragile sanity. But let's not forget the tools of survival, those objects that helped sailors fight back when disaster struck. For example, the ship's anchor, a massive iron weight, essential for holding the vessel steady during storms. Or the compass, a small magnetic device that could mean the difference between drifting endlessly or finding land. In those days, Navigation was a mix of science and superstition, and a sailor's chance of survival often depended on how well he read the stars or trusted his compass. And when sickness struck, when the fever took hold or dysentery set in, they relied on rudimentary medicines, soaked herbs, alcohol, or whatever they could improvise. Sometimes, sailors used the cargo's salt and vinegar to disinfect wounds, a crude but necessary solution. Imagine a sailor's trembling hand as he tends to a bleeding cut, the pain sharp and cold like the salty air. Infection could spread rapidly, another wave of suffering washing over the crew. Now contrast all this with today's ships, air-conditioned cabins, medical supplies, instant communication. Back then, sailors faced all this with a patchwork of makeshift solutions, their human bodies and minds pushed to the limit. Every plank, every nail, every personal object was a tiny lifeline against the chaos. So if you want to get even closer to the real human story behind these voyages, how they survived storms, disease, and despair, just think about the objects they carried. They weren't just possessions, they were symbols of hope, resilience, and the human spirit. Each one held a story of bravery, fear, love, or loss. And trust me, understanding these objects makes the history come alive. It's not just dates and maps, it's real people, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding, fighting every wave and wind to reach the new worlds waiting beyond the horizon. If you're curious about exactly how sailors managed to keep going, what they carried, how they fought sickness, how they faced storms, you'll want to check out the video I've got coming up. We'll peel back the layers of history and get even closer to the human experience of these maritime adventures. But for now, just imagine how these brave souls endured their voyage. One wave, one sickness, one object at a time. It's a story of resilience, suffering, and human spirit that still echoes across centuries, reminding us how much we're capable of enduring when survival depends on it. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a creaking ship, the salty wind whipping your face. The horizon stretches endlessly, but it's not just the sea that's vast. Your mind races with the stories of those who sailed these waters centuries ago. Back then, life wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about pure survival. And to survive, sailors carried not just tools, but objects that became part of their very souls. Now, picture a small, battered chest tucked into a sailor's cabin. Inside, a handful of personal items, each one a tiny lifeline. These objects weren't just possessions, they were symbols of hope, resilience, and sometimes sheer human stubbornness. Today, with modern ships, we can forget what real hardship looked like. But if you want to understand the true story of these voyages, what kept people alive and fighting against the odds, you need to look at what they carried. Because behind every object is a story of human endurance, despair, and occasionally miraculous survival. Let's start with one of the most common, a simple pocket knife. It wasn't just a tool, it was a multi-purpose lifesaver. Imagine the chaos of the open sea, waves crashing, storms howling, crew members constantly repairing torn sails or hacking through tangled ropes. That little blade was a sailor's best friend. It could cut rope, carve wood, or even serve as a makeshift medical tool in a crisis. And sometimes, it was their only link to survival when things got desperate. Imagine trembling hands, cold and sweaty, trying to staunch a gash with a rusted blade, blood mixing with salt water, pain sharp and unforgiving. And speaking of pain, many sailors carried a small vial of makeshift medicine, often just alcohol or soaked herbs. It wasn't much, just a crude attempt to fight infection or dull the agony of wounds. Think about it. You're at sea miles from land, your body trembling with fever or pain, gingivas bleeding, teeth feeling loose from scurvy, infections creeping under the skin. The remedies: salt and vinegar, sometimes crushed herbs. These were fragile shields against a relentless enemy. Disease. Infection spread fast like a wildfire in dry grass, transforming a minor cut into a death sentence. But the real horror was what came after. The mental toll. Imagine you're a young sailor, far from home, your body aching, your mind fraying. Every day you watch comrades succumb. Some die from fevers, others from the despair that sinks deeper than the cold Atlantic. These objects, the knife, the herbs, a worn photo tucked into a pocket, become anchors. They remind you of life beyond the storm, of loved ones left behind. They're what keep hope flickering amid the darkness. Now, let's take a different object, a small crucifix or religious token. For many sailors, faith was their only refuge. When everything else failed, when storms threatened to swallow the ship or sickness drained their strength, they turned inward. Prayer became their shield against despair. Imagine clutching that tiny object, feeling its rough edges pressed against your palm, seeking courage from something unseen. It's cruel but real. This reliance on faith when the physical world is collapsing around you. But not all objects were spiritual. Some sailors carried personal keepsakes, photographs, lockets, or even pieces of wood from home. Imagine a sailor clutching a fragment of his mother's quilt or a lock of a loved one's hair. These tiny tokens were a tether to the world they'd left behind. They'd see them in the dark, trembling hands clutching these mementos, drawing strength from memory. In the endless night of the Atlantic, these objects became beacons of resilience. And still, there were objects that revealed the brutal reality of life at sea, like a small jar of salt. It was not just for seasoning. It was a vital disinfectant, used to clean wounds when no proper medicine was available. Imagine the sting of salt in an open cut, the blood and salt mixing, the sailor wincing as infection loomed. These makeshift solutions, gathered from what was at hand, were often all they had. Easily overlooked but vital were small pieces of wood, shavings or splinters that could be fashioned into makeshift splints. Imagine a broken arm bandaged with torn strips of cloth, the pain dulling into numbness. These seemingly insignificant objects, bits of the ship itself, became part of their survival toolkit. And then there are the objects that reveal the human toll, their psychological scars. Think about the sailors who, after months at sea, look in the mirror and see gaunt faces, sunken eyes, gums bleeding, teeth falling out from scurvy. Their bodies are battered, but their minds often suffer even more. The constant threat, storm, sickness, starvation, changes them. Some become hardened, others broken. Yet every one of them carried that tiny object that might remind them of home, of life after the voyage. But here's the twist. These objects tell us not just about survival, but about transformation. Those sailors who once were young and eager often returned physically changed, more stoic, more hardened. Some carried scars that told stories of battles fought within their bodies. The experience of enduring storms, sickness, and despair left marks deeper than any sailor's tattoo. Now, compare that to today. We're protected by technology, air conditioning, instant medicine, communication with loved ones. We can forget how fragile life was back then. Those sailors faced the vast, unpredictable ocean with just a few makeshift tools and their human resilience. They endured the cold, the hunger, the horror of losing friends, and still they pressed on. Their sacrifices, silent, often forgotten, paved the way for the world we know today. It's humbling, really, because these objects, these tiny pieces of history, are more than relics. They are echoes of human courage, the stories of those anonymous sailors who, despite everything, refused to give up, who fought sickness with vinegar and salt, who clung to faith and who held on to keepsakes that made the endless ocean feel just a little less lonely. And that's the real legacy. Not just the ships or the maps, but the indomitable human spirit. The stories of people who, with trembling hands and trembling hearts, faced storms, sickness, and despair, and still found reasons to endure. If you want to know what it really meant to sail those treacherous waters, just remember, behind every object is a person fighting to survive, fighting to hold on to hope. Their stories remind us how far we've come, how much we owe to those brave, often forgotten souls who crossed the oceans so we could have the world we live in today. So next time you see a ship's relic or a picture of a sailor, think about what they endured. Think about the objects they carried and the stories they tell. They're not just pieces of history. They are the human spirit made visible, and their courage is a legacy that continues to inspire us, no matter how many centuries pass. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next video, where we'll dive even deeper into the human stories behind maritime history, because the ocean's not just about waves and winds, it's about the people who braved them and the objects that kept them going. Their sacrifices echo across time, reminding us that resilience is part of what makes us human.